Solitaire Rose Radio, Episode 38, The Solitaire Rose History of EC Comics, Mad, Issues 1 through 5. If you were to ask anyone in the United States, they would know Mad. They may have read the magazine. They may have watched the show in the 90s. They may have watched the Cartoon Network show. But Mad is one of those things that always feels like it's been around. The odd thing to me is most people don't know Mad started as a comic book. And as I've said before, it was the only thing EC published pretty much from 1956, 1957 on. Even the mass market books were put out by Signet or Ballantine. Mad didn't publish them themselves. EC published Mad, and it published the giant sizes, which started as annuals and then just became things that came out every few months. But as I go through the history of EC, I wanted to hit Mad, because Mad is one of the most influential comics ever published. And because it was EC's biggest selling comic. By the time it ended, it was EC's biggest selling comic. And the fact that Harvey Kurtzman demanded it be made into a magazine is probably the thing that saved EC. Helping me go through this will be cartoonist, actor, screenwriter, movie maker, local TV star and horror host, and a damn handsome man, my friend Thommy Lange. Thommy is a huge fan of Mad. He has the artist edition of Mad. Whenever I go over to watch movies, we end up talking about Mad or EC or our shared love of 70s Marvel Comics, sometimes to the exclusion of actually watching the movie. Okay, mostly to the exclusion of watching the movie. But I thought I'd bring him on because I wanted a different person's perspective rather than me going through. He's able to correct me on a few things, which I always enjoy. I love it when I'm able to give out correct information and the stuff that's stuck in my head is not quite right. That's one of the reasons why I call these the Solitaire Rose history instead of something like the definitive history. This is the stuff that I've learned, that I remember, and it's good to get other people who know more than me. So, a couple things about this. This was Tommy's first podcast, although he's done television and radio and stuff. And his internet connection got a little wonky at times. You'll see at the end that it kind of cuts off because his internet connection went completely kablooey. The other thing is he has two Dachshunds, and they decided that they wanted to be part of the show. So I did what I could to cut them out, but you're going to hear them from time to time. I don't know if their commentary is worthwhile, but it's there, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, there's a lot of nudity I was surprised by. I reread them last night to take notes and everything. It's like, they're showing ass all the time.
Oh yeah. Those first, the first, well, when it was a comic book, yeah, I think that's where I learned about sex personally.
Oh.
You know, with the little pocketbook reprints that they had at the supermarket.
Oh, you see, for me, that's where I learned about school food. Because by the time I was reading it, it was all jokes about school food.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about it more in the show. But then when I discovered the nostalgic Mad, it was like, hell's this?
Oh, my introduction to Mad was one of the paperbacks called the Bedside Mad. The first story of which was Harvey's take on the Inner Sanctum.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I was twisted for life at the tender age of 7.
And so you got the paperbacks before the magazine.
Yeah, I was aware that the magazine existed. I'd seen it on the newsstand, but being 6, 7 years old, I'd always assumed that was not for me. It wasn't Archie, it wasn't Bugs Bunny. It wasn't something like that. So I figured, that's for teens. I probably wouldn't understand it. I didn't bother with it. I was just aware that it existed, look at the cover, and that was about it. But my mom at the time was having health issues and spent a lot of time at the Mayo Clinic. So I would get shuttled to my aunt and uncles or my grandparents while they were out of town doing that. And I was staying at, might as well have been her sister. It was her best friend for life. And they had this cool sort of little tiny apartment on the second floor of their house where I would stay. And, they sent me to bed. It was 10 o'clock. Being a night owl, what am I going to do? There was no TV up there. So I'm just rummaging through all the stuff and I find this book, The Bedside Mad. I'm like, okay, whatever. And I was hooked. It was love at first sight. I read it through cover to cover. I probably didn't go to bed till 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, wow.
But I have to say I probably didn't understand half of it, but it was fascinating. Elder's little chicken fat things. It was the first time I'd ever encountered anything like that. It completely blew my mind. I'd never seen anything like that.
For me, it was my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, still lived with my grandparents, and he had Mad Magazine.
Okay.
And I don't really remember when I started reading it because I would read whatever they had. She had like old Dell comics and and I was big on Richie Rich and Casper and not so much Archie because Richie Rich in the 70s was into the mystery stories.
Ah, yes, yes.
And of course, if you're a kid, if it says mystery or ghost, you're like, ooh.
Yeah, you're all over that. Yeah.
That's mine. Yeah. And I think I had to be like 11 or 12 when I picked up one of the Best of Mads, the big, thick ones, because I was always the thicker the better.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And it had the nostalgic Mad. And I'm reading it and going, this is very different from the other stuff. And they basically said it's from when Mad was a comic, and that was it.
Yeah, there was no background information to it. That was one thing. I discovered those later on, and I went to just the Snyder's up the corner from where I was staying there, and they had one of those little paperback spinners that they used to have at the drugstores, and they had several of the I forget who was doing them, but like the Mad Reader, Fighting Mad, those sorts of things. They probably put out 20 of those things in the 70s.
Oh. I remember in Mad Magazine that they had a list that took up half a page.
Yeah, exactly. So and some of them were Kurtzman heavy, and some of them were, from the Feldstein Gaines years later on. So I, paged through and I bought every one of them that had anything that was drawn by Elder, Wally Wood, Jack Davis, any of the Kurtzman comic book era stuff. And just poured through it. I probably didn't get off the couch all day. Like I said, it completely turned my world upside down.
One of the things that you and I have talked about is how Mad was such a huge influence on your life. How did it influence how you started drawing? And then you also have done theater, you've done television, you've done all this stuff. Did you kind of bring that influence with you as you did those things?
I did. I think I discovered Mad right around the same time I discovered, Marx Brothers movies, things like that. Monty Python came quite a bit later, and by then I think I had already sort of formed my style. But in terms of illustration, I wanted to be Jack Davis. I wanted to draw like Jack Davis, and I can't.
I don't think anybody can.
No, I don't think so. I've seen Howard Nostrand and people like that have tried, and it just doesn't work. I just, one of the things that I think unconsciously I took from it is how well Harvey laid out a page. You don't really get that looking at the pocketbook reprints because they cut them up and reformat them to fit the little, the 3x7 or whatever pocketbook. In the nostalgic Mads, you get the full page printed out, you can see just how well Harvey would lay out a page and how it flowed from panel to panel. It was something that I kind of, had picked up when I started reading some of the Marvel comics, some of the better stuff. But I think being, I guess a humorist, that influenced me much more than say a really well drawn issue of Spider-Man. The chicken fat, the little fiddly bits that Will Elder would stick in. You can read a story and then you can go back and spend hours just looking at the little fiddly bits, and then a few years later when, puberty started to hit, I discovered my dad's stash of Playboys in the closet. And yeah, there were naked ladies in it. That was great. But there was Little Annie Fanny drawn by Will Elder and written by, Harvey Kurtzman. And like, that opened up a whole new world. And there again, I think is a lot of where I learned about sex. Or, what I think of as sex is probably, a very juvenile version, but, nevertheless. So yeah, in terms of like writing, certainly there's the Yiddish aspect of it. I'm not Jewish. I can't pretend to be, but I think that influenced me quite a bit. Again, it goes, the Marx Brothers, Woody Allen, a lot of funny Jews in my life. So, I think consciously or unconsciously, certainly it's influenced everything I've done. Even to Horror Incorporated, which, had very little to do with that sort of thing. I wanted to do an episode, and I figured I'd be the only one that would find it funny, where we have to go, up Madison Avenue to find Mr. Kurtzman, who's gone mad. So, our Heart of Darkness sort of a thing.
Oh, that would have been good.
Yeah, see, and I think you and I would have been about the only two that would have found it funny.
Now, you worked with the Mall of America when they had Camp Snoopy.
Correct.
And one of the things, they didn't do a Peanuts parody when Kurtzman was there, but one of the things about Bill Elder that even going through this, you start the first 5 issues, he's not doing it as much, but you start to see that he is such an unbelievably good mimic.
Oh, he's amazing.
Of other artists.
Yeah, no, I know. He did a Peanuts parody, I think, under Feldstein, and it looks like Schultz drew it. One of the great regrets is that when Harvey took on Plastic Man as Plastic Sam, he had Russ Heath do the art, and unfortunately, Heath just sort of did a perfunctory inking over Harvey's layout. So it looks very much like Harvey drew it. But had he given that to Elder, I think he could have mimicked Cole's design and style to the ink stroke, and it would have been so much better.
As we're going through EC,
mm-hmm.
I've talked about how Gaines really didn't want to publish comics. He was kind of strong-armed into it by his mom, and he and Feldstein became very, very close very quickly. Kurtzman came in later pretty much as an artist.
Yeah, he came in with a stack of his Hey Look and some of the stuff that he had done for Stan Lee at Timely.
And his time at Timely is very interesting to me because Stan basically said, just do these, I'll figure out where to fit them in because they're so great. I want them in my comics, but I know I can't sell a comic of just one-page strips.
Right.
So you'd be reading a horror comic or a romance comic or a war comic, and there's a page of Harvey Kurtzman's Hey Look.
Right.
And did he do much other work in other comics before coming to EC?
He had done some comic strips. He had done a Western spoof, Potshot Pete. Now, I don't recall if it ever sold. I would have to look that up, but he had done some. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, Stan would use him as just an artist for other things. And then when they ended the run of Hey Look, he kind of gave him this horrible, horrible Blondie ripoff. Stan sort of felt that Hey Look had run its course. And I don't know why, Rusty it was called.
Oh, okay.
And it looks exactly like it is a poor man's Blondie, down to, the style of hair and things like that. And, I know Harvey hated it, which is why he left to look for, something more challenging, which he found at EC.
And he came to EC. The first thing they put him on was actually a educational comic that they'd commissioned about
Yeah,
VD
yeah,
that had a song in it.
yes. Yeah, I've been trying to find that. I came across it once on eBay, but, not being a millionaire, I wasn't able to pick it up.
And Kurtzman had already started editing. He edited Two Fisted Tales.
Yes.
And when I talk about Two Fisted Tales, first off, I'll probably have you on because you're kind of my Kurtzman guy. But Gaines and Feldstein did not understand what Kurtzman was going for at all.
No, no, not at all.
To the point where Gaines and Feldstein said that they had one story in the first issue, and you can tell which one it is because it's the worst one. And Gaines just kind of let Kurtzman do what he did.
Yeah.
And then when the Korean War started, war comics sold better, so he gave him a war comic, Frontline Combat. And one of the problems with Kurtzman has always been that he's too meticulous.
Yes. He would spend days, sometimes weeks researching a single story. Where Feldstein could kick out an entire issue of, Tales from the Crypt or Weird Science or whatever in a week. Whereas Harvey, he'd spend several days up to a week researching a single story.
And now we get to kind of the first controversy around Mad, and that is who created it.
Yeah.
I've heard Gaines' side in interviews where Gaines said that Feldstein was editing 7 books, Kurtzman was editing 2. Kurtzman came into his office to complain that Feldstein was getting paid more. And Gaines said that's because he's editing so many more books than you. Tell you what, if you come up with another book that I want to publish, I'll be able to give you a raise because then you're editing 3 books. And Kurtzman kind of hemmed and hawed. And finally Gaines said, that funny stuff you're drawing on the back of the pages, just do a whole comic of that. Just do that.
Yeah. Harvey said a similar tale, but of course it was all instigated by him. He was that, he told variations of it in various interviews, but what I've read most consistently is that, yeah, he was, barely able to make it by. He's married, had a house, and, he was making, a third of what Feldstein was. And, according to him, he was in the hospital. He was jaundiced. He was so overworked. And I think, and you had pointed out that came later in his career.
Yeah, they actually mention in Mad that he was in the hospital. I think it's issue 3 or 4.
Yeah. It's so, his tale is spun to be, very Kurtzman heavy. And while he was in the hospital, he came up with this idea, well, why don't I do something easier? Why don't I do a third book? Just a funny book. And what I tend to believe is more what Gaines said. Feldstein very much said along the same lines. As far as who came up with the title Mad, Harvey said he did. What I tend to believe is that Gaines and Feldstein were calling their horror and sci-fi books Mad Mags. And Gaines had suggested to Harvey, well, do this humor book. You came in here with a stack of funny stuff. You're a funny guy. You're a humorist, Harvey. Do a funny book. Why not call it, Mad Mag or The Mad Mag? And Harvey then just shortened it to Mad. That's what I tend to believe. Not having been there, I can't say.
And in a lot of ways, this was kind of the first parody comic and may have been one of the first parody magazines. They were magazines that did parody, New Yorker especially. But Mad was sort of the first thing that was all they did.
Yeah, well, there were several that were more of a magazine. There was one that did just advertising spoofs. which was popular for a while. I think it started in the 30s, but had kind of petered out post-war. But yeah, Mad was, I mean, very much an original animal. It created what we think of, I think, today as a satirical magazine. They hadn't really existed. You wouldn't probably have had the National Lampoon or something like that had there not been Mad, had there not been Humbug, had there not been Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah. As I was writing a novel set in the 50s, and the premise of it was, what if Saturday Night Live had started in 1949 as a radio show instead of in 75 as a TV show? And one of the things I found very fascinating was there was a lot of college, and I don't want to call them underground because underground connotates something, but a lot of really small press and college publications that were parody. But there wasn't much out there that did parody. What we think of as improv had really not been created yet.
Right.
So there wasn't sort of this thing for Kurtzman to pull from. And one of the things that really struck me as I reread this, because I haven't reread the Mad comic in a long time, was how the first couple issues were basically EC, they were parodying what EC did.
Yeah, they're not really specific parodies of any specific. I think the second issue there's a science fiction story I think it's called Blobs, that is a specific parody of a science fiction EC title. But other than that, they were just sort of more generic genre parodies.
Yeah.
There's a Western, there's a mystery, there's, pretty much, the entire, I think there's 4 stories in that first issue, and each one, covers a specific genre that EC had titles on. And then, by the second issue, it starts to focus in just a little bit. You get, Melvin of the Apes, which, as you read it, it doesn't really strike you as a very specific Tarzan parody. It's just more of a jungle adventure kind of a parody.
Yeah.
The third issue, it gets a little bit sharper, but, in there's a Dragnet parody, which is the first very specific thing. Now, they're parodying the radio show, so Elder didn't draw them to look like Jack Webb, and I forget the name. Ben Alexander, I believe, was the other actor. It wasn't until like the 11th issue that they did it again, and then by that point it was a TV show. Everybody knew what they looked like. But then when you get to issue number 4, this is the moment everybody sort of pinpoints as the beginning of what we think of as Mad today, when they did Super Duper Man.
Yes. And, well, why don't we just get into the individual issues? Sure. The first issue has an iconic Kurtzman cover that I swear I've seen more than any cover except Action #1 and Fantastic Four #1.
Yeah, right.
This has been everywhere.
I actually had a poster of it when I was a teenager. I'm not where I got it. I have no idea, but I had it as a poster.
And it shows Kurtzman's style. In the other EC stuff he'd done, his stuff was more realistic. It was more, I don't want to say like EC had a house style, but he was drawing much more realistic. This was a very cartoony cover.
Well, yeah, he was drawing, what was expected of a comic book artist at the time in like Two-Fisted Tales. You can discern his ink line. It's very distinctive, but yeah, when you get to Mad, this cover, this is what Hey Look looked like. This is what Potshot Pete looked like. This is Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah.
The only thing that's missing is the little Kurtz and stick figure man after it, which he did not put on the first cover for some reason.
Well, he's learning his way.
Yes, he is.
The first story is called Hoo Ha, which has been actually stolen as the name of a comic style by a couple people who work in comics, Tom DeFalco and Ron Friends, when they do just pure silly action stuff. They call it a hoo-ha style.
Is it from this?
It has to be, because Tom DeFalco, who was editor-in-chief of Marvel in the late 80s and early 90s, worked at Archie, and we know that everybody at Archie knew everything Kurtzman did because John Goldwater could not wait to sue Harvey any chance he could.
Absolutely.
But as an EC book, it had some of the same layout
Mm-hmm.
and a very similar story, but it had one huge difference, and that was Kurtzman did not use the Leroy lettering.
No, he very much preferred the hand lettering, which I tend to as well. I think the Leroy lettering system looks very rigid. This has a fluidity. Now, I don't know who did the lettering. I don't think any of that's ever credited. But from what I understand, he would do the layouts. Someone would do the lettering and deliver the Bristol boards to the artists already lettered. But it gives it an energy and a flow. You look at Panic, which Feldstein edited, and he was a big proponent of the Leroy lettering system, and it just doesn't have a flow. And part of that is that he wasn't as meticulous in laying these out as Harvey was. But it also just the lettering looks very rigid.
One of the reasons he did it was because he knew that he wrote very text heavy, and he wanted it to be easily read with the crap printing that they were getting.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever actually seen a Mad comic from the 50s, a genuine article, but yeah, the printing is abysmal.
The gags to me seem very standard. You have the cowardly man and it's the opening from Rocky Horror Picture Show. They're driving along, the car breaks down, they go to a spooky mansion.
Absolutely.
He's a chicken. But other than the over-the-top reactions, Davis's style to me doesn't seem that much different from what he was doing in the horror mags. Now, in Kurtzman's war books, he played it dead serious, but his work in the horror mags always had that kind of right on the edge of doing humor.
Yeah, it was always just sort of on the verge of hysterics, and I think it works really well in both instances. And yeah, no, I think his stuff in the war comics for Harvey, it's almost a little stiff, and I think I've heard him complain about that a few times as well. But once he got to Mad, he kind of let loose. And this is, I've always been a little disappointed by the first issue because it is very tepid. It's very timid. He's finding his voice. He's finding his way. But the art, that's, I think, what first drew me to it was the artwork. When I found that paperback, the Elder style, certainly, and Jack Davis. And then shortly thereafter, I did pick up what would have been a concurrent issue of Mad in the store. I believe it had the Sting in it or something like that, so you dated it accordingly. There was Jack Davis still drawing for Mad. None of the others were. And I think Davis's ink lines are always fascinating. He's just lots and lots of cross-hatching, lots of blacks, lots of thick lines, thin lines. He's excellent at this sort of stuff. I think when he tried to do the more serious stuff in the Frontline Combat or Two-Fisted Tales, it doesn't have the same energy.
The next story is Blobs, science fiction parody by Wally Wood.
I referenced that earlier, but it's not the one I was thinking of. I think the one in the second issue is a more specific parody. This is, again, just a standard sci-fi sort of non-specific genre spoof. It's funny. The art is excellent, but you didn't see these reprinted very often later on. No. They're not really representative of what people have come to expect as being, the nostalgic Mad.
The first thing that popped out at me, I looked on the first page, and it's the first instance of a small gag that has nothing to do with the story.
The little robot
Where,
playing baseball.
yeah,
Yeah.
Wood drew some little robots playing baseball. But the thing that I took away from it is this, if Wood would have drawn it in his more serious sci-fi tone, it would have been in weird science or weird fantasy.
Right.
There wasn't really a lot in the way of jokes. It was a build-up to a typical EC twist at the end.
Yeah, right. Yeah, again, this first issue is a lot of just more non-specific genre parodies, which this one is, and as such, it's, you know, it's okay. It reads well, but yeah, it could have been just at home in you know, Weird Science or Tales to Astonish or something like that.
Yeah. The next is our first Will Elder story, Ganeffs.
Yeah, which the gangster parody.
And it really was kind of the first story where the gags were take normal situations to the extreme.
Right.
And Kurtzman used the small tough gangster guy with this big dumb helper. But there's an actual plot here.
Yeah, right.
That flows and makes sense, but it's also where each page is separate on its own.
It reads very well. It has a really nice flow to it. It's the first story in this first issue that feels like, okay, you're reading Mad.
Yeah.
You know, and I think part of it is the Elder art, and he hasn't really started to do a lot of the chicken fat. There's a little bit in the splash panel, but it's much more intermittent. And I just wonder if he was influenced by Wood putting the little stuff in his or vice versa. I don't know that, but you know, it's very typical Will Elder style, but it's kind of just missing that extra touch that he would bring to it later, where every panel would be just jam packed.
Yeah.
Stuff.
The final story is the Western, John Severin doing a Western parody. I thought the first page was amazing.
Oh, yeah.
It's an excellent visual of all the noise and chaos and using the sound effects to sort of create this feeling that everything is, there's so much going on.
Right. Yeah. There's just, it's so full of life.
And the rest of it, to me, this is the one story that falls completely, utterly, totally flat on every level.
Yeah.
And each page sets up a revelation. Bad thing is it builds to a twist that just, it doesn't work as either serious or parody. It just comes off as kind of dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know what I can add to that. I couldn't agree more. And the weird thing is that as associated with Cracked magazine as John Severin is, and as good as his stuff there was, he never really fit with Mad. Never really captured Harvey's style. Never really fit the material as well.
I do think his work in Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales was head and shoulders above the Mad work.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I'm not, you know, he's one of my favorite artists. Don't get me wrong.
But he never captured humor to my mind.
I think he fit the Cracked style far better than he did here. And I don't know if it was just because it was a kindler, gentler sort of a thing or what, but that was the sole reason I would pick up an issue of Cracked later in life, is that, you know, John Severin oftentimes did 90% of the artwork.
And to me, the reason he worked in Cracked was because the seriousness of his drawing would contrast with the humor of the writing.
Right.
Because I can't think of a whole lot where I went, Severin drew something that was funny in and of itself.
Oh, no, I don't think so. And there again, I think that's why, one of the reasons it doesn't work here.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, Davis's art, Elder's art, Wood's art, it's funny in and of itself, adding an extra layer to the writing.
one of the things Gaines has said about Mad was it was a hit from the first issue.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Well, sales-wise.
Yeah, I don't even know if that's necessarily true, but okay, I'll take him at his word.
I can say this, it's the only EC book that went monthly.
It is that. Yes, that's true.
All of the other ECs remained bi-monthly. Part of it was because Feldstein could only do a book a week, and he was doing 7.
Yeah.
But it was also that, and as we go through, we'll talk about how newsstand dealers would tell distributors what's selling. The distributors would go to the publishers and tell them what's selling, and Martin Goodman would then do 20 of whatever was selling well.
Yeah.
But there was a parody boom in 53 and 54.
Right.
Almost as big as the romance boom, where everybody was putting out 2 or 3 of these.
Right.
Which ate up, it ate up the audience. But Mad was the one that continued to grow.
Well, I think Mad was the smartest of the bunch. It had an element to it that the others just don't. The closest one that approaches it, other than maybe Panic, but I've always found that to be a little tepid in comparison, is Andrew and Esposito's Get Lost. Unfortunately, there were only 3 issues because Gaines sued them. He lost, but they stopped publishing anyway. But that came the closest in spirit. They seemed to get it, whereas some of the others were just stupid or they just didn't quite get the humor style, or I don't quite know how to put it into words, but they just sort of fall flat.
Right.
There's, Timely did Nuts, I believe it was. There's some good stuff there, but, it's more of a specific genre parody. It tended to focus more on the horror stories. But, Mad just sort of floats to the top. I think it was you had that combination of Kurtzman and then Elder, Wood, and Davis, just hitting it out of the park.
And with issue 2, Jack Davis did do the cover.
Did the cover, yep.
And to me, it looks, other than the body position, it looks a lot like a horror cover.
It does.
And again, you could have put this on Tales from the Crypt and it wouldn't have seemed out of place.
Right. Not terribly, no. I mean, it would have just toned down the exaggerated pose a little bit, the goofy look on the guy's face. But other than that, yeah, it would have certainly fit right there.
And this was also an issue that started one of my favorite Kurtzman things, and that is the running gag.
Right.
The name Melvin is used on every possible chance in this comic.
It starts on the first issue on the cover. That thing, that slithering blob coming towards us, what is it? It's Melvin.
But then in the second issue, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere, right.
The first story is Hex by Jack Davis, which actually one of the few of these early issues where the cover reflects something inside the comic.
Yeah, right. Well, I think the cover of the first one is vaguely reminiscent of the Hoo-Ha story in that, they're in a scary old house, but that's about it. It's very tenuous. But yeah, this one is very specific to the point where it has the same artist.
Yes. The other thing about the story is, other than the names that they gave the baseball players, it's a baseball horror story, and they do a lot of parody of giving the baseball players names that are kind of funny versions of current baseball players. I don't see a difference between this and a Tales from the Crypt story.
No, not really. Not a lot. I mean, again, the artwork is a little more over the top than you might see in a Tales from the Crypt. The poses are a little more extreme. There's a little more slapstickiness to it. But yeah, other than that, the story itself is fairly straightforward.
The next story is Melvin of the Apes.
Yeah, which I'd referenced earlier as almost the first specific parody, but as you read it, it really just sort of reads as a generic jungle story parody. There's really not a lot of jokes or whatever that poke fun at the whole Tarzan trope. I didn't find.
I didn't either. It's another one drawn by John Severin, who does an excellent job.
Oh yeah, no,
not a funny job, but an excellent job.
He's an excellent illustrator. But again, I think this sort of material is lost on him, and he either could not or would not draw sexy women. So the Jane character looks very plain, whereas certainly had Wally Wood drawn it, she would have been all over the place.
Yeah.
You know.
And the gag at the end, it actually feels like something that like Avon or Ziff Davis would have done with their parody. It wasn't funny. It didn't work. They spent way too much time building to it.
The setup is intolerable. And you get, by issue 4, 5, or 6, it would have flown through this. You get to like the King Kong parody, and it just zips by. And yeah, this one just takes forever to build up to, it's a long way to go to find the stores closed.
Yeah. The next is another Wally Wood science fiction parody called Gookum.
Yeah, this one I believe, if I remember correctly, and I don't remember the name of it, but it is a specific parody of another EC story from one of their science fiction magazines.
Okay.
If we revisit this, I'll try to find it in the meantime, but I know I've read the actual story it's spoofing. And it's very close. I mean, this one, it gets a little, certainly the splash panel, you start to get some of the little goofiness that you associate with it. Certainly compared to Blobs in the first issue, this is leaps and bounds ahead.
Yeah, Wood is really kind of loosening up, doing more cartoony stuff. I think this may be the first time where he drew a character that's basically his whole body houses an eye and has arms and legs, which Wally Wood loved drawing.
Yeah, oh yeah, you see those.
Any chance he could.
Yeah, you see those a lot.
One of the things that struck me as I reread it is there's a really good gag that they just kind of, because the story is so busy, it just passes right by. And that is a little tiny spaceship, and then a really tall guy gets out of it. And as I read it, it's like, that's a cool gag. Too bad it was kind of done poorly.
Yeah, it's thrown away in the third panel on the first page. And yeah, it's almost like you blink, you'll miss it. It's almost not presented as a gag. It's just, and it's unfortunate. Had it been, whoops, what did you do? Anyway, had it been laid out differently or done over a couple panels, I think it would have played really funny. And as it is, it's just sort of thrown away.
Again, disappointed with the ending. I didn't think it was all that funny.
No.
But Wood's art, because it is loosened up, because he is so good at what he does. You get the unbelievably gorgeous Wood women.
Right.
You get the characters that all seem very different, the cartooniness. It works on that level.
Yeah. I mean,
but Kurtzman is still kind of breaking out of the EC. We have to have a twist ending. You have to have a twist at the end.
Well, he kind of did that all along. I guess less and less as it went on, but certainly that was sort of a hallmark of these early Mads, that they would all have sort of that twist EC ending, usually with a gag, not always at work, like in this instance. But I think Wood, Kurtzman often said his art was stiff, and I don't find that to be the case. I think
it's stiff when he's doing serious stuff, but when he loosens up, and in his later work, especially like on Wizard King and the stuff he did for Wit's End, I find his stuff to be so just this wonderful mix of storytelling and cartooning.
Right.
That some people who are really good at one can't do the other. He could do both.
Yeah.
His serious stuff was okay, but if you let him do his fantasy or his humor, I thought it just leapt up by levels of how much better it was.
I've got the that artist edition that reprints the original art boards at the size they were drawn, and I will sit and stare at those. Still, I've had it for several years, and I'll still sit. And you look at his brushwork in the inking, and certainly like Flesh, the Gordon parody. It was a Flesh Garden, I think they call it.
Yeah.
Several issues later, it's gorgeous. It's it's everything you could want from that sort of a parody. It looks like the original, yet it's funny. And I think this here too. I mean, it looks very cartoony, yet it plays by the rules of this genre.
The final story is Mole by Bill Elder. This was the first kind of mad comic book story I ever read. And I remember when I got to the end of it as a kid, just feeling a little disturbed.
Yeah, it's a little dark, yeah.
And this also, Elder is adding more and more of the chicken fat in this.
Yeah, now this I think is where you start to see the Elder House style.
And you also get more of the, okay, we're exaggerating for humor's sake, whereas a lot of them would rely on different techniques. With Elder, especially when the mole is thrown into a jail cell and there's the warden with bajillions of guns, just the barrels of these rifles that aim at wherever the mole is in the cell. And the digging just looks so cool. And it really, to me, this is kind of like, okay, this is what Mad is.
Right, and I think what you're starting to see here is something that influenced me and influenced Kurtzman, influenced Elder a lot, is Looney Tunes. You're starting to see the influence of Warner Brothers cartoons from the 40s, which I know they absolutely adored. You're starting to see that show up, and you'll see it more and more as these issues continue. And as you say, yes, then it's become the Madhouse style. Things like, the way the mole tunnels through the ground, he took a left turn at Albuquerque. It's straight out of Bugs Bunny. And the way those guns are, dozens of, and I think there's more each panel.
Yes.
It's out of a Daffy Duck cartoon. So they're finding their voice. Little by little, slowly, Kurtzman is finding his voice.
And the thing is, this is just the second issue.
Right.
When I went through with Kirby, to me, the Fantastic Four, while the early 30 issues are good and interesting, Kirby didn't find his voice till sometime between issue 30 and 40 is when what we think of the Fantastic Four completely locked into place.
Right.
And Kurtzman's kind of locking things down very early on. The third issue was the first to have a letters page.
Yep.
And unlike the horror comics, they would have longer letters. This is just short bits of people, saying they like it. Boom, 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 boom. There were a few who didn't like it.
Yeah.
But you could see that the readers were picking up on the running gags.
Right, yeah. They reference Melvin and things like that.
So for a new comic, especially a number one comic, to get a reaction from people. And one of the things Gaines said is he never made up a letters page. Other publishers would.
Oh, yeah.
Marvel in the 70s, if they weren't getting the kind of letters they liked, they would write their own letters and print them to kind of guide people. This is what we want people to send letters about.
If you read them, you could tell, too.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I never thought these were anything but genuine. And they would take just a little blurb, and in some instances, a single word that, you're right. The readers are picking up on the style. They'll mention Melvin. They'll do a sound effect. Hang on. Stop it. Stop it. Right now. They'll there's a couple here where it's just a sound effect.
One of the things I've talked about is how Gaines would always put what he felt was the strongest story in the number one position. And it was usually an artist he felt was doing the best job. In the horror books, even though the Feldstein stuff did not win the poll, he would put it as the anchor story because he felt if someone's flipping through a book, they're going to see this very clean artwork.
Right.
They're going to buy the book. In the first two, it was Jack Davis. In this, Bill Elder has been moved into the top spot
Right.
with the Dragnet parody, which, as you said, was a parody of the radio show. I don't think the TV show existed yet, did it?
I don't believe so, because this is what, 52, 53?
Yeah.
So no, I don't think it had appeared. When they revisited half a dozen issues later, then the characters looked very much like, Jack Webb and Ben Alexander. Here, Sergeant Friday looks a lot like Sherlock Holmes. It looks like
Yes.
Basil Rathbone almost. To the point where he's got a pipe.
This also is the first one that has the full chicken fat effect, to my mind.
It's exploded everywhere. Yep. No, this is, you open the cover of this and this is Mad Mag. This is the Mad comic book. You're there. It hit the ground running with this one.
Yeah. And it really feels like that full anarchist humor where stuff is happening. There are tons of running gags. There are bits that go all the way through. There are bits that are just in a panel. Really strong parody elements. And the humor is both in the text and the visuals, especially the "How's your mom, Ed?"
Yeah.
And the sidekick character talking about what he saw at the movies through the whole story.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with anything that's going on in it.
Well, it was an exaggeration of, they would do these little bits on trying to sort of humanize what were very one-dimensional characters. So they would throw these little things in where, Friday would ask, how's your mom, Ed? And then Kurtzman just, takes that and totally blows it out of proportion to the point where, yeah, it's running through, every other panel they're talking about it.
The other thing that really struck me is what I've been talking with people about Letterman and Letterman's style, where he would tell a joke over and over and over because Letterman knew it's funny, then it's not funny, then it's not funny, then it's really not funny, but somewhere along the repetition, then it becomes amazingly funny.
Yes, it's funnier than it was the first time, yeah.
Right, and then each time you bring it up, it's funnier.
Right.
Kurtzman uses that to that effect in this.
Yeah.
He knows that the running gag, you've really got to just go back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's talking about a Flash Gordon serial he saw or something.
Yes.
And yeah, in the middle of action and mayhem, he'll reference it again, and yeah, I think as I was rereading them, this is the first time it felt really full metal mad.
The next story is Sheik of Arabia, again by John Severin.
It's another weaker one, I felt.
Yes. There are actor caricatures.
Yes.
And it really felt like, my notes here say, it feels like an angry Warner Brothers cartoon. One of those cartoons that would have the famous actors popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
Except everybody keeps being killed, everybody dies. It's a really, really violent story.
Very violent one. It struck me as just sort of filler.
Yeah. And the gag at the end was so beneath them.
That didn't go anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's a long way to go to find the stores closed.
Yep.
Yeah, no, and I'm not going to fault Severin here. The material's weak to begin with, and I think his drawing in this one is a little bit looser than he usually does. And maybe it's the actor parodies. I don't know if that's what Harvey intended or not, or if Severin just worked them in. But again, I just don't feel he ever quite got it
right,
like the others did. And you'll find that with Kriegstein would do a couple stories and he would ignore the layouts and do it his way. And I just,
he ignored everybody's layouts.
Yeah. but they just don't quite fit. And I think it's the same with Severin's stories here. And this one, I think it's just Harvey banged it out to fill, 8 pages.
Yep. The next one is Vampires, Wally Wood, and really, other than Wally Wood's drawing of the female form, there's not a lot to recommend here.
There's not. I always liked this one as a kid, and I think you nailed the reason why just now. She's gorgeous.
Yes.
She's absolutely gorgeous. I would have, stepped over my own mother to find a woman in real life that looked like that. Uh, but otherwise, yeah, it's a fairly weak horror parody with a very obvious ending.
It felt, again, like an EC story.
It is. It is. I think until they started to do the very specific stuff, I think that's why the Dragnet story worked so well. It's parodying something very specific. This is just, again, another generic horror parody. It could have been in the first issue. Other than the drawing style, I think Wood's artwork is fantastic. Other than that, it could have been in the first issue and not stood out.
And even on top of that, Wood and Kurtzman used the same two little kids gags.
Yeah, right. Well, they use that frequently. That shows up again and again and again.
The final story, Jack Davis has been moved to the final position, which is another thing that Gaines did. He would put his strongest artists at the beginning and the end, which is why in so many of the horror books, Graham Ingalls had that last story. Because Ingalls' art, and when I talked about Tales from the Crypt, I really went into it. Ingalls' art, everybody looks like they're melting. It doesn't matter what it is. You could give the lamest horror story to Ingalls and it still made you feel creepy and kind of
take a shower after you've read it.
Yeah. Davis does a Lone Ranger parody. Again, this really feels like a parody of the radio show.
I think it is. Yeah, it would have to be.
And Davis is getting more and more frantic in his artwork, which makes the story that much better.
Yeah, no, I think this one reads really well. They revisited it again, I think just a few issues later, which is with a better one. But this one is this is what you would think of as a mad version of the Lone Ranger.
Yeah.
Davis, like when the sequence where he's going to jump on his horse and misses and lands on his ass, it's straight out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, but Davis, the way he draws it, and I'm certain the way Harvey laid it out, because I think Davis was one that would pretty much slavishly follow those layouts, brings it to another level. It just gives it that much more of an anarchy to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's an obvious gag. It's been done a million times. It's at the top of the second page of the story, but just, the way his legs are splayed out and with the horse galloping off into the background, it brings it to life.
And Davis's art adds so much more as he becomes more very frantic, and his characters almost have a floppy ragdoll feel to them.
They're very loose. They're very almost doughy at times. He's becoming, I think everybody starts to influence everybody else.
Yes, very much so.
You start to see some little elderisms in some of these backgrounds. Not much with Davis, but you certainly start to see a lot of it show up in art later on. And then, and I think conversely, Elder's art loosened up a little bit, so the characters are a little looser looking like Davis's.
That brings us to issue 4. Issue 4 has something that I personally find interesting. In the letters page, there's a letter from Larry Stark, who's one of the most prominent EC fans, not just at the time, but long after. Larry Stark now does a webpage called theatermirror.net, where it's for the Boston theater area. And Stark is, I've knew him when he was on the Genie National Bulletin Board. Still a huge fan of comics, but a bigger fan of theater. During this time, though, with every EC comic that came out, he would write a long critique, sometimes 3 and 4 pages long, of each issue.
Oh, wow.
Pointing out what he liked, what he didn't. He and Bob Stewart put together some of the early EC fan magazines. And he rarely got printed because his letters were so long they really couldn't grab parts of it.
Sure.
But he talks in this letters page about how much he feels that Mad is genius, and he's talking about the first issue.
Right.
And in talking with him,
Second issue.
he's of the opinion that the first issue, when it came out, was really kind of a, oh wow, no one had any idea where it would go, that it would go to the heights it did.
Right. He actually references the second issue.
Oh, okay. The other thing in the letters page that I think is important is there is a plea from Gaines, because Kurtzman wouldn't have cared.
No, he wouldn't.
But there's a plea from Gaines to, hey, ask the news dealer to get these from the distributor. EC was one of the smaller publishing companies. They only had the 9 books
Right.
at their peak. Well, they had 10 at their peak, and we're going to add an 11th. But for all the talk of how Tales from the Crypt was such a huge seller, at its peak it sold between 400 and 500,000 copies. For comparison's sake, Walt Disney Comics and Stories was routinely selling 3 to 4 million copies. Sales were much bigger across the board. One of the things that always burned Gaines was that the other horror books, which weren't as good and came after his, outsold his.
Right.
But this was kind of Gaines calling the EC fans, hey, put our books in front, tell the news dealer to get them, here's how to subscribe. Really kind of a hard sell.
Yeah, it is. It is.
This is also the issue that when people talk about Mad, most of the critics, they point to this story as the beginning.
Right.
I disagree and you disagree, but when they talk Super Duper Man is where Mad became Mad.
Yeah, I don't agree with that, but I think it's the first really accessible example of that. So I think it's an easy target to point to as, yeah, this is the story. I don't agree. I think there was stuff in the second and third issue that did it just as well. And referring to a very specific instance where DC or national periodicals at the time sued, help me out here, who published Captain Marvel?
That was Fawcett.
Fawcett. Right here in Minneapolis.
Yep.
They sued, over copyright infringement for Captain Marvel. And I believe, didn't they take then ownership of the character as a result?
What happened was, and this was before everything wrapped up, because that suit had been going on for over a decade.
Right.
In 1953, sales on Captain Marvel had dipped to the point where it wasn't financially worth it for Fawcett to continue publishing it and fight the lawsuit. So they just kind of gave in and said they wouldn't publish Captain Marvel anymore. It was later that they sort of passed the ownership over to DC.
Okay.
But that adds a second layer to this parody, because the parody is Superman versus Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
But as I look at this art, I'm looking at my notes. I wrote notes for everything. I had 2 words for the art on this. God damn!
Yeah. No, I agree. This is amazing. This in that splash panel alone, look at everything that's going on. And here, Wally Wood has fully embraced the chicken fat. There's a dozen signs in the background.
My favorite is when good drawings are drawn.
Yeah, they're drawn by Wood.
Yes.
And,
a little self-promotion there. Good for him.
Why not? And, the little, there's the 2 little kids again in the corner flanking the sexy woman. This is, in terms of style, of material, I can see why people single this out as the moment. Cause it's all here. I mean, it's really, really well done, but I don't believe it's the first specific parody that it's often pointed out as.
The next story is a Jack Davis crime parody called Flob Was a Slob.
Yeah, this one, again, I think is a specific parody from one of their romance books, if I'm not mistaken.
Nope, it's one of the crime books.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, and one of the things is it has all of the standard EC crime tropes. Yeah, the woman who is the two men who are fighting over a woman, and and really it's almost this dual level parody because you've got the Flob character who's, wanting the always looking for butterflies, and the woman is dealing with, a criminal. But then at the end, it kind of, much like an EC, flips it on its head and then pulls a joke that I'm amazed that they didn't get in more trouble for.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the story ends, the woman who's been telling us the story, yeah, she went back to the criminal and now she's selling pot for him.
Yep. Yeah.
So pot humor in 1952-53.
Right, yeah, and evidently very successful at it.
Yeah.
Based on the crowd of children surrounding. Yeah, no, I was struck by that too, and where was Estes Kefauver when that was printed?
The next one is Robin Hood by John Severin, and I literally have no notes on it. I could not make it through this story.
There's not a lot to say. It falls back to like the Sheik of Araby and things like that. And later on they would do like Milty of the Mounties. And it seems like that Kurtzman would continue to do these sort of half-assed generic parodies, give them to Severin because he really didn't elevate it anywhere. The fact that it closes out the issue is a little, or no, I guess it doesn't.
Nope. Elder closes the issue.
Out. That's right. Yeah, with a really good one.
Yeah, with the shadow.
But yeah, no, Robin Hood. There's not. It's a very standard. This could have appeared in one of the competing satire books, and it would have been right at home.
Yeah.
There's just nothing about it that, other than Marie Severin's recoloring for these Cochrane reprints looks fantastic, but that's neither here nor there. I'm sure the original printing looked like shit.
No, it didn't look. It looked okay because Marie was coloring at the time. One of the things that is interesting to me is on some of the earlier issues when there's crowd scenes, she would kind of do knockout where, okay, all of these people are going to be colored blue and all of these people are going to be colored red. And I wonder if it's because she was a little stretched thin with adding a new book.
Very possible, but I think it also fits the style. Again, it kind of, it brings it back to that sort of Looney Tunes aesthetic where there would be a crowd scene and an animation, it's extremely expensive to hand draw and hand paint big crowds. So there would be just sort of blobs of color and sort of generic faces. So I think it's sort of a throwback to that. Whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know. But that's kind of what it's always reminded me of.
The last story is another Bill Elder story, The Shadow and this is such a good parody that when I read Shadow novels, I will actually use the Shadow Skitty Boom Boom gag in my head without wanting to.
Well, yeah, no, this is just pure unadulterated Kurtzman Elder at their best. This whole thing, it plays so well, like again, they've got the panel with the guys with 30 guns pointing at the bar, the mayhem that occurs, and it's funny. It's all funny. The writing is funny. The art is marvelous.
There's so many beautiful little gags in it. Reading it again, I haven't read these for a long time, but where the knife is thrown at the invisible shadow and then it looks like blood is pouring out and the next panel is, they got me right in my bottle of ketchup.
Ketchup, yeah. Yeah.
And the twist ending in this one, actually, it works story-wise and it's also very, very funny.
Yeah. It's one of the few early instances where that sort of EC kind of twist ending fits it. Like I said earlier, often to squeeze them in, they don't always quite work. Here it does. Here it feels very organic to the story.
Yes. Issue 5 is one that got them in all kinds of trouble. There are two things. One of the gags in here actually got written up in a newspaper editorial, but the inside page, the EC publisher of the issue, William M. Gaines, alias Melvin, where Gaines wrote a funny version of his life, during the congressional hearings actually got brought up repeatedly. Reading it again, I think it's funny. And it fits that Mad style, which shows that, well, Gaines always had a really good sense of humor, which shows when Mad was a magazine. But there's stuff here where he's constantly making fun of himself. EC standing for Evil Comics.
Yeah, right.
I don't care if it ain't got a plot. I don't care if it don't got grammar. And I don't care if the pitches ain't from the talent. All I care about is that every story, sadism, snakes, masochism, pyromania, snakes, fetishes, snakes, necrophilia, phallic symbol snakes, and all the rest of that esoterica, what I can't think of at this moment. And today, Gaines lives in a 69-room mansion. I can see why. And again, at this writing, he is single, having been married and divorced 69 times. Don't send fan mail. He can't read. He's getting away. He didn't get away with it, but he's just, okay, no one's going to care except the adults who are reading this, so why not make them laugh?
Right. Yeah. I mean, odds are most kids didn't even read this. But yeah, I think it's hilarious. It's and then we get to the story, this Outer Sanctum, which is my inauguration to the world of Mad and Harvey Kurtzman.
And actually, one of the chicken fat gags on here had an editorial about the depravity and perversity of this comic. Advertisements: nice, clean, fat errand boy wanted.
Right. Yeah.
And the editorial said that this was a perverse sex gag.
Yeah.
And Gaines and Kurtzman and Elder all said, no, he's a ghoul. He's looking for somebody tasty.
Yeah, it's a cannibalism gag, which I suppose would sit better than a pedophile gag, I suppose. But
one of the things I like is that they slow down to tell the gag.
Yeah.
The first page, while you've got all the chicken fat stuff, it's also, nothing happens on this page but a door opening to set up the gag on the next page.
Yeah, it's 8 panels in before anything happens. It's just, and it's 7 panels of the door opening, which, if you're not familiar with the Outer Sanctum radio show, opened with the sound of a creaking door, and then this character Raymond who would introduce the tale. And again, this is all from radio.
Although the actual plot of the story itself is a direct parody of Theodore Sturgeon's short story It.
Yes.
Which was ripped off for the Golden Age character The Heap, who they actually used the same name.
Yeah.
And was also the inspiration for Man Thing, Swamp Thing. What was the bog creature at Atlas Seaboard? Pretty much every swamp creature is ripping off that story.
Yeah.
And again, Elder's work is amazing.
Well, this is the one that kept me up all night, just looking at it over and over again. Noticing little things like the skeleton rowing the kayak through the second panel on the third page. Little things like that. The stuff in the beakers that changes from panel to panel. Everything from false teeth to a ship in a bottle. It's just amazing how much he threw into these. And you read it once, it's there, but I always have to go back once or twice and just look at everything. There's just so much going on in here.
The next one, Black and Blue Hawks, is a parody of a comic that I bet 90% of the listeners don't even know. The Black Hawks, which DC bought from Quality Comics, and then in the 60s turned them into the worst superhero team you've ever heard of, ever. They've since brought them back a couple of times doing serious stuff with some really high-name creators that no one has ever cared about. But it was quite popular at the time.
Yeah.
And this story just, there are some gags that are there.
They're there. That doesn't mean they work or they're particularly funny.
Which is weird because it is Wally Wood.
Yeah.
And I do like how they kind of are using Chop Chop as kind of, okay, here's this racist character who's in the book for no reason whatsoever. We don't know why he's here. So they poke fun at that. But really, Wood just kind of whiffed it on this one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's another one where it could have been at home in a competitor's humor book and would have been just fine. Yeah, I actually fell asleep a couple times reading it the last time I went through it. So maybe the less said, the better.
Yeah. And then we have Milty the Mounties, our John Severin story, which again,
Another one that just really doesn't go anywhere. I thought.
and yeah, they're visual gags that should be funny.
Well, here, you get Severin trying to sort of fit the mold a little more than he had been in the past, where it was much more straightforward. But it just doesn't. It doesn't quite work. He's no Jack Davis. He's no Will Elder. He's a very good illustrator, but this is not the kind of material that he excels at.
And the last story in issue 5, Kane Keen, Private Eye, a Jack Davis story, showing that Jack Davis can draw sexy women too.
Yeah. Yep.
It's
not as frequently, but yeah, these ladies are, particularly the brunette that comes storming in. When I was a teenager, this would have been it.
I don't think Mickey Spillane was huge yet, but this does really hit that Mickey Spillane hard-boiled detective story that was very popular in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. Very text-heavy, but because of Davis's art style, and especially how he draws the lead character, it's a lot of fun to read.
It is. Now, I always felt it was more of latter-day Raymond Chandler-esque. You don't quite have that seedier side that Spillane did. To me, it struck me as, someone writing a hard-boiled detective story, not a specific target, but it's got the narration, it's got the femme fatale, the woman showing up at the office. It all very Big Sleep sort of stuff.
And the revelation where everybody's in the room and the detective explains in detail what actually happened.
Yeah.
Which, I love the Thin Man movies, but boy, that trope gets really old fast.
Tires pretty quick. You see that parodied frequently on like Monty Python's Flying Circus, which just points up how ridiculous it really is. I mean that even the Maltese Falcon does that at the end. So yeah, here he's poking fun at that, but I never quite felt there's a Mickey Spillane-ish feel to it so much. More of a Chandler, later day Chandler, where he gets a little seedier, but it just doesn't have that depravity that Spillane had.
And that brings us to the end of issue 5. Again, this is like a year that the book has been published, and the difference between issue 1 and issue 5 is unbelievably pronounced.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge.
Even more so from Tales from the Crypt and the other horror books went from kind of horror-based crime stories to that really what you think of as an EC horror story with the walking corpses and vampires and the horrific twist endings.
Yeah.
Now, the science fiction magazines, they kind of were there from issue 1.
Yeah.
But Mad has, over its first 5 issues, kind of its first year, really has sort of hit where most people think. But the thing about Mad is, as you get toward the later issues, like from issue 20 on, it can't be characterized. Kurtzman is playing with the form so much. That was Mad, issues 1 through 5. I'm going to try to do Mad 6 through 10 next month. It's going to depend on Tommy's schedule, but we are in the middle of the summer of podcasting. That's right, there is a new Solitaire Rose radio podcast every week until Labor Day. And then after Labor Day, we're adding a new podcast to the Solitaire Rose radio network. We may be adding more. I'm really working with some people to bring their podcasts in. They won't be part of the Crazy Comics and Stories feed. They'll have their own feed, but they're going to be hosted on the Solitaire Rose website, and I'm kind of excited about the new directions we're going. One of the things we have is we have advertisers. Now, if you want to be an advertiser, just go ahead and email me. I have a rate sheet and everything. But here's our advertisers. Pretty much every form of entertainment has advertising, and this one is no different. Our first ad is for DreamHost.com. DreamHost.com is the best web host in the whole known universe. I've been using them for 14 years. They've always been able to help. They have great services. If you need a web page, they are the best. Just go to DreamHost.com, and if you use the code CRAYZ, that's KRAYZ, you get $20 off your first year. Our second advertiser is Graze.com. Graze.com is healthy snacks delivered right to your door so that when you're at work, you can avoid the vending machine. When you're home, you don't have to reach for the bag of chips. It's dried fruit, it's new ideas. I get it every 2 weeks, but you could get it more often. Great food at a great price. And if you use the reward code Cory S3R5P, your first and fifth boxes are free. That's CORY S3R5P. And if you're listening to this here podcast, you're one of the most good-looking people on the internet. And you don't want to trust your skin to just any old razor, so shave with the amazing razors you get from Dollar Shave Club. Every month they send a box with your shave supplies at the beginning of the week, or whenever you want. You can pop in a fresh blade and get that fresh blade shave. It feels fantastic, and it's just one of the many ways that you can maintain the good looks that everyone has come to expect from you. That's Dollar Shave Club. If you go to dollarshaveclub.com/crazy, it kicks a little back. All of these advertisers, they kick a little back to us, so we can wet our beak a little. We're not asking for much. We're not asking you for money. But if you need these things, go to our advertisers. They support this podcast. Thanks. I want to thank everybody for all the input I've gotten, for the emails, for the messages on Facebook. Go over to Facebook. Go to facebook.com/Solitaire Rose Radio. Be a fan. Let me know what you like. Let me know the kind of stuff you'd like to hear more of. As I said, it's the summer of podcasting. I got a whole bunch of stuff coming up. I actually have a schedule all written out, so we've got some fun stuff for the rest of the summer. And I always say, be back next time where we'll tell more stories.